Sir, stop right there. This is a United States Navy warship, not a harbor cruise. The public tour is back down the pier. You do not get to walk up my brow because you found a patch in a surplus bin." The voice belonged to Lieutenant Junior Grade Sloane Coyle, officer of the deck, 25 years old, and certain of every inch of the deck under her polished shoes. She stood at the top of the brow in summer whites, clipboard against her hip, and she looked down the short steel ramp at the old man the way a person looks at a problem that has interrupted a good morning. The old man stopped exactly where he was told. He stood on the second cleat of the brow, with one hand resting light on the lifeline, and he did not argue. He had crossed worse water than this to reach worse places than a pier, and he had learned a long time ago that the loud ones tire themselves out if a man only lets them. It was Fleet Week, and the guided missile destroyer lay against the pier with her haze-gray flank thrown open to the public. Bunting snapped along the rails, families queued in the sun, old men in association ball caps drifted up the brow in 2s and 3s, and a banner near the quarterdeck read, "Welcome home." Frogmen in letters somebody had ironed on by hand. The harbor glittered. Gulls argued over the water. It was the kind of bright, ordinary morning that does not feel like the day anything happens. The old man wore a faded red windbreaker, zipped halfway, and on the left breast of it was a small embroidered patch, subdued and worn soft at the edges, the colors long gone gray. He wore no cap that said anything. He carried nothing. He was perhaps 80 years old, lean the way old rope is lean, with close-cropped white hair and pale eyes that did not blink against the glare off the water. "Request permission to come aboard, ma'am," the old man said. "I was told there was a reunion." He said it quietly, in the old phrasing, and he turned a quarter step as he said it, facing aft out of a reflex 60 years deep, toward where the colors would have flown. He did not seem to know he had done it. The chief of the watch heard the old phrasing the way a musician hears a true note in a noisy room. Senior Chief Boatswain's mate Otis Kowalski, 52, was leaning over the quarterdeck log with a pen in his fist, and he looked up at the sound of it. He looked at the way the old man stood. He looked at the patch. Coyle did not look at any of that. She looked at her clipboard. She ran a manicured nail down the list of names and found nothing, and she used the nothing the way some people use a weapon. "You are not on my list," she said. "No name, no badge, no escort. There is a process, sir. There is always a process. So unless somebody important is waiting on you, you are going to step back off my brow and let these people through." "My name's Ledford," the old man said. "I gave it at the gate." "There are a lot of names at the gate." Coyle smiled without warmth and gestured at the families backing up behind him on the pier. "You are holding up the line, sir." The old man looked once at the families, and then he stepped back. He came down off the brow cleanly, without a stumble, one hand trailing the lifeline until the last cleat, and he moved aside so the next group could pass. A man in an association cap nodded at him on the way up without a flicker of recognition, the way you nod at a stranger. Kowalski watched all of it. He watched the way the old man came down a steel ramp at 80 without looking at his feet, the way a man does only if he has spent 10,000 mornings on worse footing than this. He watched the patch catch the light and go dull again. He could not place it yet, but something in him had gone quietly to attention, and it would not sit back down. "Senior Chief," Coyle had turned back to the log, "why are you looking at him like that?" "No reason, ma'am," Kowalski said, which was the first untrue thing he had said all morning. Coyle had been the officer of the deck for 3 hours, and she loved it. She loved the clipboard and the rope and the small, clean power of deciding who came aboard and who did not. She had finished near the top of her commissioning class, and she had been told her whole life that attention to the rules was the same thing as competence. and no one had yet shown her the difference. So when an old man in a windbreaker stood at the foot of her brow with no name on her list, she saw only a gap in a procedure, and she filled it the way she filled every gap, with herself. The old man, for his part, was reading her the way he had read the Hool. He saw the high polish on the shoes, and the newness of the collar device, and the way her eyes flicked to the gallery to check whether her authority was landing. He had trained 100 young sailors exactly like her. He knew that some of them turned into men like Kowalski, and some of them turned into nothing at all, and that the difference usually came down to a single bad morning that taught them what they were made of. He suspected, standing there in the sun, that this might be that morning for her. He was sorry for it, a little. Not enough to leave. On the pier, the old man found a clear place by the rope and stood easy in the sun, facing the ship. He did not look angry. He did not look hurt. He looked the way the water looks on a calm day, when you cannot tell from the surface how deep it runs or what it has taken. The laughter and the line noise washed over him, and he let it. He had waited longer than this, in colder water, for worse things. And the chief of the watch kept watching him, because men who take an order that cleanly have usually, somewhere, given a great many of their own. The line moved past the old man and forgot him. That was the thing about being 80 in a red windbreaker on a bright pier. The world arranged itself so that the eye slid off you, and you became part of the scenery, like a bollard or a coil of line. A young family slowed near him. The father, herding 2 small boys, glanced at the old man and asked, kindly enough, "You with the tour, sir?" They said it starts up top. "No," the old man said. "I used to do a little sailing is all, a long time ago." He said it mildly, and the father smiled and moved his boys along, satisfied, never knowing he had stood 3 feet from a man whose name was cut into a wall in a building he would never be cleared to enter. The old man watched the boys go up the brow, and something moved behind his eyes, and then was still. Up on the quarterdeck, 2 sailors were rigging a welcome banner along the forward lifelines, and the line they were using fouled. It snarled on the brow stanchion and jammed, and Petty Officer 3rd Class Dustin Kruger, 22, and the Petty Officer of the watch, hauled on it the wrong way, which is the way that turns a snarl into a knot. "Take the strain off the bitter end first," the old man said from the pier, not loudly, not pushing. "She'll come free." Kreuger ignored him, the way you ignore a bollard that talks. He hauled again. The knot drew up hard, and the loose end of the line whipped off the stanchion and fell to the pier, landing in a heap near the old man's feet. The old man bent and picked it up. His hands moved without him, the way a thing learned young never quite leaves the body. He flaked the line, found the bitter end, and coiled it down into a clean, fast hank, over and under. The loops laid so true they could have been measured, and he held it up to Kreuger across the rope. "Clear your stanchion and she'll run," he said. Kowalski watched the coil form in the old man's hands and felt the back of his neck go cold. It was a frogman's hank. It was fast, and certain, and economical, and exactly right. The coil of a man who had coiled lines in the dark and underwater and under fire, where a fouled line could kill you. You did not learn to coil like that at a reunion. You learned it in a place that took the people who did it badly. Kowalski had coiled 10,000 lines himself and taught hundreds of young sailors to do it, and not one of them had ever done it like that on the first try. You could spend 20 years on deck and never coil like that. He found himself watching the old man's hands the way you watch a card sharps, waiting to catch the trick. Except, there was no trick. There was only a lifetime of doing a hard thing correctly, in the dark and underwater and under fire, until correct was the only way the body still knew how to move. He told himself he was being a sentimental old chief, seeing legends in a windbreaker, because some part of him wanted there to be one. Sailors did that at reunions. They made every quiet old man into somebody. But the old man's eyes kept going to the ship's lines and finding the small wrong things that a tourist could never have found. And with every one of them, the easy, sentimental explanation got a little harder to hold. "Senior Chief," Kowalski said quietly to the air, to himself. Then, louder, stepping to the officer of the deck. "Ma'am, that old man handles a line like he was born on a deck, and he came up the brow facing aft. I would go easy." "Senior Chief," Coyle said, not looking up. "Half the men on this pier think they ran the Navy. They all coil line. They all face aft. It is a reunion for old sailors. He is still not on the list." The old man set the coil on the cap of the bollard, neat, and stepped back to his place. He looked up at the ship's lines, at the way she sat against the camels, and he said, mostly to himself, in the precise vocabulary of a man who had spent his life on the water, "She rides heavier aft than her sisters. Somebody hung topside weight on her she was not drawn for." He read the hull the way another man reads a face he has known for 50 years. Kowalski heard that too. He had served on 3 of her sisters, and he knew it was true. And he knew that the average grandfather at a reunion didn't know it. The old man asked, then, mild as milk, "Is the association table still set up on the mess decks, or did they move it to the hangar this year?" He knew the ship's layout. He had never been told it. He knew where they would have put the coffee and the folding tables and the framed photographs of men long dead, because he had been on 100 ships like her, and the Navy does some things the same way for 100 years. The chief of the watch wrote nothing in the log, but he did not take his eyes off the old man in the red windbreaker, because he had begun, against all the morning's evidence, to suspect that the surplus bin patch was the realest thing on the pier. By the 3rd time the old man stood quietly at the rope, Coyle had decided he was a story she could tell. She had a gallery now. Kreuger, 2 more sailors on the watch, a loose crowd of tourists with phones. And a young officer with an audience is a dangerous thing. "He's making another run at it," she announced to the watch, jerking her chin at the old man. "Gramps in the windbreaker. That is 3. You have to admire the persistence." Kreuger laughed, the loud, helpful laugh of a junior man laughing at his boss's joke. A few tourists smiled. "Tell you what, Pop," Coyle called down the brow. "You stand right there and guard the pier for us. Real important job. We will wave if we need you." The old man did not answer that. He looked at her. The way you look at weather you cannot change, and he stayed where he was. "Nothing?" Coyle said, enjoying it now. "Come on. You sailed, you said. What were you? The guy who painted the anchor?" "I did paint an anchor or 2, the old man said. And then, because she had asked him a question about the ship, he answered it the only way he knew how, with the truth, quietly. "She is a fine hull, your ship, steadier than she looks. But you have got a man up on the 03 level leaning on a stanchion that is not landed right. Somebody should square that away before an admiral sees it." For half a second, Coyle stopped, because there was a man on the 03 level, and the stanchion was canted, and she had walked past it twice that morning without seeing it. The old man had seen it from the pier, past her in one glance, while she was busy being clever. She covered it with a bigger laugh. "We will get right on that, Admiral," she said, and the gallery laughed with her, and the moment slid by, caught by no one on the pier except the chief of the watch, who had seen the old man's eyes go to the 03 level and back, and had felt the morning tilt another degree under his feet. It was a small thing, the canted stanchion, the kind of thing only a man who had stood 1,000 quarterdecks would even notice, let alone care about. But that was the tell, and Kowalski caught it whole. A grandfather at a reunion looked at a warship and saw something big and gray, and impressive. This old man looked at her and saw a job left half done on the O3 level, the way the captain saw it, the way the chief of the watch saw it. He was not admiring the ship. He was inspecting her, gently, out of a habit 60 years deep, and he could no more turn it off than he could turn off his own pulse. And he had done it past the officer of the deck, around her, while she was busy making him into a joke for the crowd. That was the part that put the cold in Kowalski's chest. The old man saw everything. He was simply too courteous, and too tired, and too used to being unseen to say so. Kreuger, encouraged, lifted his phone and framed the old man in it. "For the group chat," he said. "The legend of the pier." The old man did not pose, and did not flinch, and did not turn away. He simply let himself be photographed, the way a stone lets itself be photographed. And there was something in his stillness that made Kreuger lower the phone after a moment, without quite knowing why. "Knock it off," Kowalski told Kreuger, low. "Both of you. I am telling you there is something wrong here." "Senior Chief, relax," Coyle said. "It is a joke. He is having a fine time. Aren't you, Pop?" The old man said nothing. The laughter rolled down the brow like loose gear in a swell, gear that nobody had lashed down, the kind that slides and gathers weight and eventually puts somebody in sick bay. And the old man stood in the middle of it without moving, the way he had once stood in things far louder than the laughter of children, in water that was not bright, on a night that did not end, the way this morning would. If you have ever watched the young forget what the old once paid, stay with this one, and subscribe to the Veteran Vault. It stopped being a joke when Coyle's eyes settled on the patch. She came down the brow to the rope, close now, and she pointed at the faded gray embroidery on the old man's chest, the way a customs officer points at a false declaration. The gallery leaned in. This was better than the persistence bit. This had teeth. "That is a team patch," she said. "That is a detachment patch. You know what we do to people who wear what they didn't earn? Stolen valor, they call it. It is a crime, actually. So let me ask you straight, in front of everybody, and you think hard about your answer. Where did you really get that? An estate sale? Your brother-in-law's footlocker? eBay?" Of all the things she could have said, she had chosen the one word that could touch him. Stolen. He had buried men who earned that patch. He had carried one of them 2 miles through black water, with the patch on his own chest going dark with another man's blood. And a child in clean whites was standing on a sunny pier, telling a crowd he had bought it. He let the word pass through him like cold water through a wetsuit, felt it, and didn't let it stop his heart. "It was given to me," the old man said. "A long time ago. The men who would vouch for it are on a wall now." "How convenient," Coyle said, and the gallery made the low, ugly sound a crowd makes when it has decided to enjoy something it should be ashamed of. "All your witnesses are dead. Every fake's witnesses are always dead." "Most of mine are, yes," the old man said. There was no self-pity in it. It was a fact, like the tide. The crowd shifted. Some of them had fathers who had served, or grandfathers, and the word stolen sat badly with them now that it hung in the air over a man who looked so much like their own. But discomfort is not courage, and not one of them stepped forward. They looked at their shoes and their phones and the gangway, and they let a child in a clean uniform speak for all of them, because it is always easier to let the loud one talk. The old man understood that too. He had seen crowds before, in villages, in airports, in courtrooms, on 100 piers. And he knew that a crowd is the most cowardly animal there is, and the most easily turned, and that the only thing that ever turns it back is one single person who refuses to look away. He waited, without much hope, to see whether there would be such a person here. He did not expect it to be the senior chief, but he was not surprised when it was. Take it off." Coyle's voice had changed. The fun had curdled into authority, and authority that has gone too far in public cannot back up. "Take the patch off or leave the pier. You do not get to stand at the foot of a United States Navy warship, cosplaying as something you are not, while these kids look at you and think it is real." Bystanders began to look away. There is a particular silence a crowd makes when it knows something is wrong and has decided not to be the one to say so. A shuffling, downward, shoulder-turning silence. A woman pulled her son back a step. Nobody spoke for the old man. Kreuger, God help him, was filming again. Kowalski had heard enough. He came off the quarterdeck and down to the rope and put himself half a pace from the old man, and when he spoke to his officer of the deck, his voice was flat and hard and stripped of every courtesy but the one that mattered. "Ma'am, I am telling you as your chief, stand down, right now. You do not know who that is, and you are about to do something on this pier that you will not be able to take back." Coyle's jaw tightened. She was committed now, in front of the crowd, in front of her watch, in front of a senior chief who had just contradicted her in the open. The worst place for a proud person to be is one step past the point where backing down is free. "Then enlighten me, Senior Chief," she said, "because from where I am standing, all I see is an old man and a fake." The old man's hand rose to the patch. It rested there a moment, flat, the gnarled fingers covering the soft gray threads, the way a man covers a wound or a grave. And it stayed. He did not take it off. Because some things you do not surrender on a sunny pier to a child in a clean uniform, no matter how loudly she asks. Kowalski had gotten his closest look at the patch when he stepped down to the rope, and what he saw stopped the breath in him. He knew that detachment insignia, not from a book. He had stood in front of it 100 times in a team heritage space 3,000 miles away. A quiet room with low light and framed photographs and a glass case, and that exact patch hung under a black and white photo of a young frogman with blacked face and pale eyes, and a small brass plate beneath it that Kowalski had read so many times he could see it with his eyes shut. He looked at the old man's pale eyes. He looked at the photograph in his memory. They were the same eyes, 57 years apart. The chief of the watch turned and caught Kreuger by the sleeve, and all the performance was gone out of his voice. "Listen to me. Put the phone away and run. Find the captain. Find the flag officer who came aboard this morning for the reunion. The vice admiral. He is on the mess decks. Tell them the chief of the watch needs them at the brow. Tell them it is about a man on the pier. Go. Run." Kreuger looked at his face and stopped laughing and ran. Kowalski turned back and stood beside the old man at the rope, and he was not the chief of the watch anymore. He was a barrier. He addressed the old man with a care that made Coyle's eyes narrow, fishing, gently, for the thing he already half knew. "Senior Chief Kowalski, sir," he said. "Boatswain's mate. That debt patch. I've seen it. In the team room, under a photograph. Would you do me the courtesy of telling me your name? Your whole name." "Ledford," the old man said. "Eugene Ledford. It was a long time ago, Senior Chief." He glanced at Coyle, and something almost gentle crossed his face. "Let the young lady have her morning. She is not the first person to be sure of something. The water does not care how sure you are." Kowalski heard the kindness in it, and that was almost the worst part, because a fraud does not forgive the person exposing him before the exposure has even come. A fraud gets loud. A fraud produces papers and witnesses and outrage. This old man had stood in the sun for half an hour, being called a liar and a thief, and the only heat he had shown was a single hand laid flat over a patch he would not surrender, and now he was asking them to go easy on the girl who had done it to him. Kowalski had met exactly two kinds of men who behaved like that in his life. Saints, and men who had been so far out past the edge of things that ordinary cruelty could no longer reach them. The old man did not look like a saint. So the chief of the watch asked again, more carefully than he had asked anything in years, and he kept his eyes on the patch the whole time, as though afraid it might vanish if he looked away. The name landed on Coyle as nothing. Ledford, an old man's plain surname. It meant nothing to her at all. But it meant something to the way Otis Kowalski straightened. The senior chief came up off his slouch by half an inch, his shoulders squaring, his chin leveling, his whole body answering a name his mind had just confirmed. And that, Coyle saw. She did not know the name. She knew what it did to a 52-year-old senior chief with 28 years on the deck plates. She had never seen Kowalski stand like that for anyone. A flicker of doubt crossed her face for the first time that morning. Just a flicker. She covered it the only way she had left, with rank and volume. "Senior Chief, you are out of line," she said, but her voice had a threat in it, now that had not been there before, a hairline crack in the certainty. "Return to your post." "No, ma'am," Kowalski said quietly. "Not this time." What the young officer in the pressed whites did not yet know is what the next few minutes would teach her in front of the whole pier. Subscribe so you do not miss it. Somewhere behind the superstructure, a sailor was running flat out along a passageway, and the chief of the watch had heard one plain word, a surname, and gone pale, and the morning had stopped being ordinary, though only 3 people on the pier knew it yet. To understand what was about to walk down that brow, you have to leave the bright pier and the bunting and the laughing crowd and go back 57 years, into the dark, into the water, to the only place this old man's stillness ever came from. It was the spring of 1969 in the Mekong Delta, on a night with no moon. The water in the mangrove canals was warm as blood and black as ink, and 4 men moved through it without sound. Their faces were blacked with grease paint. They wore no rank and carried no names. They were a SEAL element, the new word for the old frogmen, and they had come up the canals on a flat boat and then slipped over the side into the water 2 miles short of the target, because the last 2 miles had to be silent, and nothing on earth is as silent as a frogman in his own element. On point was a 23-year-old petty officer, the others called by a name the enemy had given him first, King Snake, for the way he came out of the black water where no one expected him, fast and quiet and impossible to find again. At his shoulder, where a swim buddy belongs, was Petty Officer Second Class Wade Ferris, 21 years old, from a town in Ohio that had a water tower and a diner and not much else, who had a girl and a plan and 4 months left on his tour. "Stay on me, Wade," the young Ledford breathed, barely a sound. "Eyes on the bank. We are ghosts until we are not." They went into the water the way frogmen always had, quietly, and as if they belonged to it more than they belonged to the land. Their job was a snatch, a Viet Cong tax cadre, a man who collected money and names and would know more than either, sleeping in a canal-side hooch under a thin guard. Intelligence wanted him breathing. The 4 of them had practiced taking him 100 times. They came up out of the canal at the hooch like something the river had grown. For 90 seconds, it went exactly the way it had gone in rehearsal. They had their man, bound and stunned, and they were backstepping toward the water. Then the night came apart. The cadre had not been under a thin guard. He had been under a heavy one, dug in and waiting, and the dark filled all at once with muzzle flash and noise, and the flat, wet smack of rounds finding the water and the bank, and, once, a man. The element broke for the canal the way they had drilled, dragging their prisoner, and someone had to hold the rear so the rest could reach the water, and the someone was always King Snake, because that was who he was. He held the bank alone. He covered the withdrawal with a calm that did not feel like courage from the inside, only like a job, putting himself between his swim buddies and the muzzle flashes, buying them the canal a second at a time. This is the calm the crowd on the pier would mistake, half a century later, for the meekness of an old man. It was never meekness. It was the stillness of a man who had already decided, at 23, that he would be the last one in the water. A round had found him on the bank, high in the shoulder, a flat hammer blow he barely registered until much later. And he held the rear anyway, changing magazines by feel in the dark, calling the withdrawal in a voice so level that the man on the prisoner thought, afterward, that Ledford must not have understood the danger. He had understood it perfectly. Understanding it was not the same as being ruled by it. That was the whole secret, the one thing the schools could never quite teach, and the water always could. You felt all of it, the fear and the noise and the plain arithmetic of dying, and you set it down on the bank beside you, and you did your job anyway, because the men in the canal were counting on you, and counting was the only arithmetic that mattered. He gave them the canal 1 second at a time, until the last of them was over the side and into the black water. Only then did he go in himself, the last one in, the way he had promised himself on some night years before that he would always be. They made the canal. They went under and swam. And in the black water, Wade Ferris stopped swimming right. Ledford found him by feel, got an arm across his chest, and started to swim for both of them, the way he had been trained, the way he had sworn he always would. He swam Wade Ferris through 2 miles of black canal toward the boats. He talked to him the whole way, low into the water and the dark. "Stay with me, Wade. Stay with me. We are almost to the boats. Stay with me." He swam until his arms forgot they were arms. He did not let go. And it was not enough. The river took Wade Ferris a 1/4 mile from the boats, quietly, the way the river took everything. And the young man who would one day be called a fraud on a sunny pier carried his swim buddy the last 1/4 mile anyway, because you do not let go in the water, not ever, not even after. They gave him the Navy Cross for the bank and the rear and the 2 miles. They gave him 2 silver stars over the tours that followed. His own teams took the name the enemy had coined and made it his forever. And they gave him the small detachment patch that the men of that unit wore, the one that now hung faded and gray on the chest of an 80-year-old man at the foot of a brow, the one a lieutenant junior grade had just called surplus bin junk. He came home with a patch, a call sign, and a name he could not save. And 57 years later, he carried all 3 up a pier, quietly, to a child who told him he had found them in a bin. Back on the pier, the certainty in Sloane Coyle could not back up, and so it went forward, the way certainty does when pride is steering. A senior chief had contradicted her in the open. A crowd was watching. An old man would not take off a patch she had ordered him to remove. And somewhere underneath all of it was that hairline crack, that flicker of doubt she could not afford to feel, and the only way she knew to seal a crack was to put more weight on it. "I am done asking," Coyle said. Her voice had gone tight and high. "Hand it over and go home. You are embarrassing yourself, and you are embarrassing these people." She stepped past Kowalski to the old man and reached for the patch herself. Her fingers got to the soft gray threads, and the old man's free hand came up and closed once around her wrist. It did not yank. It did not twist. It did not hurt her. Quite. His hand closed over her wrist the way a hawser takes a load, without anger, without haste, and without any possibility on this earth of being moved. She pulled. Her arm did not come back. She pulled harder, and might as well have pulled against the bollard. For one full second, the 25-year-old officer of the deck stood with her wrist in an 80-year-old man's hand and understood, in her body before her mind, that everything she had assumed about the last 20 minutes was wrong. Then he let go, deliberately, because he had decided to, and for no other reason. She would think about that grip for the rest of her career. Not its strength, though the strength was the thing her body remembered first. The absolute, effortless immovability of it, like seizing a piling and being astonished that the whole tide could not move you. What she would think about on watches years from now was the gentleness inside the strength. He could have broken her wrist without trying. He had held it exactly hard enough to make her understand that he could, and not 1 ounce harder, and then he had given it back to her unhurt. That was a kind of discipline she had never met in her life, in anyone, and somewhere underneath her humiliation, a small, clear voice told her she had just stood in the presence of something she did not yet have the words for. She rubbed the wrist. The ghost of the grip stayed in it like a brand. "I have handed that patch to exactly 2 men in 60 years, ma'am," the old man said. His voice had not risen at all. "Both times it was into a coffin. I am not going to hand it to you on a pier." The crowd had gone quiet. Even Kreuger, back from his run and breathing hard, had let the phone drop to his side. There was something in the old man's eyes now that hadn't been visible before, something that had been there all along, under the stillness the way a keel is there under a calm hull. And Coyle, rubbing her wrist, took an involuntary half-step back from it. "Who are you?" she said. And for the first time, it was not a taunt. It was almost a child's question. The old man did not answer. He did not have to. Because there were footsteps on the brow now, coming down, the quick, certain footsteps of men who have been told to hurry. And at the top of the brow, the boatswain's mate of the watch had seen who was coming and had already drawn breath. And along the lifelines, the side boys were turning, scrambling, snapping into a line that had not been ordered, but that every man in it suddenly knew was about to be needed. Sloane Coyle had a hand pressed to a wrist that still felt the ghost of that grip, and she felt the floor of her certainty tilt all the way over, and behind her, the side party was coming to its feet for someone she had not yet turned to see. Vice Admiral Gerald Ashworth came down the brow with the ship's commanding officer a half-step behind him, and he was already scanning the pier before his shoe touched the second cleat, because a running petty officer had said 3 words to him on the mess decks: patch, pier, brow, and a part of Ashworth that had been a young SEAL once had stood straight up. He was 58 years old, 3 stars on his collar, and he had come up in the teams from the bottom. He had spent 30 years in rooms where the old names were spoken with the kind of hush other men save for scripture. And he came off the brow, and his eyes went to the old man in the red windbreaker, and to the small gray patch on his chest, and Gerald Ashworth stopped as though he had walked into glass. His mouth opened. What came out wasn't an order. It was a name from the Heritage Room, a name from the Planck-era photographs, a name he had said to himself on hard nights for 3 decades. "King Snake," the Admiral said. The word went across the pier like a dropped flare. Kowalski's eyes closed for a half-second, the way a man's do when a thing he has prayed for actually arrives. Coyle's head turned from the Admiral to the old man and back, uncomprehending. Then Ashworth filled his lungs and turned to the watch, and his voice cracked across the quarterdeck like a round, going out. "Attention on deck!" The deck obeyed before thought. Side boys froze. The watch snapped rigid. Up and down the brow, old men in association caps who had heard that name their whole lives were turning, removing their hats, going still. There were men on that pier who had spent 50 years telling the story of King Snake to anyone who would sit still for it. In VFW halls, and at kitchen tables, and in the team rooms, where the young operators rolled their eyes at the old salts and their war stories. The man who held the bank in the Delta. The man who swam his buddy 2 miles. The man the enemy had named because they could never catch him and never kill him. Some of them had half believed he was dead by now. Some of them had half believed he had never been entirely real in the first place, the way a legend curdles into a tall tale if you carry it long enough. And now the legend was standing at the foot of the brow in a faded red windbreaker with a senior chief at his shoulder, 80 years old, and breathing, and quietly enduring being called a fraud. And they took off their caps because there was nothing else a man could do. And then, the Vice Admiral of the United States Navy, 3 stars, and the authority of the fleet on his shoulders, came to attention in front of an 80-year-old man in a faded red windbreaker, raised his right hand slowly to his brow, and held a salute. "Master Chief Eugene Ledford," Ashworth said, loud enough for the whole pier, his hand at his brow, and his voice not entirely steady. "United States Navy, retired, Navy Cross. 2 silver stars. The man who held the bank alone in the Delta in '69, so 3 other men could reach the boats, and then swam one of them home through 2 miles of canal because he would not let go. Sir, I have looked at your photograph in the team room every working day for 30 years. It is the highest honor of my life to find you on my pier." Then the Vice Admiral raised his hand to his brow and held it, and a 3-star admiral saluted an old man in a red windbreaker and would not drop the salute, and the whole pier understood at once what it had been laughing at. The boatswain's pipe wailed, high and shaking, as the boatswain's mate of the watch piped the honors his own heart was demanding. The side party held. The crowd, which had made the low, ugly sound only minutes before, made no sound at all now. Sloane Coyle's face moved through the whole of it. Confusion first. This could not be the man she had been mocking. Then disbelief, as the Admiral's words assembled themselves into a meaning she could not push away. Then recognition, cold and total, of exactly whose wrist had been in her hand, whose patch she had called surplus junk, whose service she had named a crime in front of a crowd. And then horror, plain and absolute, draining the color from her face as she came, white and shaking, to attention beside the man she had tried to put off the pier. Kreuger's phone was down and forgotten. Kowalski held his salute hardest of all, 28 years of deck plates in the line of his arm. A moment ago, the old man had been a fraud at a surplus bin patch. Now 3 stars held a salute and would not let it fall, and a young officer of the deck stood frozen at attention with the memory of that grip still cooling on her wrist. The old man returned the salute. He did it quietly, without ceremony, the way he did everything, and only then did Vice Admiral Ashworth let his hand come down. "Stand at ease," Ashworth said to the deck, and the deck breathed. Then he turned to the ship's commanding officer, Commander Nathan Fry, 44 years old, who had come down the brow white-lipped and had heard every word. And the Admiral did not have to say anything at all, because Fry had already turned to his officer of the deck. "You are relieved, Lieutenant Coyle," Commander Fry said. His voice was very quiet, which was worse than shouting. "Lay below to my cabin. You and I are going to have a long conversation about what it means to wear that uniform on my quarterdeck, and about the difference between standing a watch and standing on people. Senior Chief Kowalski has the deck." "Aye, sir," Coyle managed. Her voice had almost nothing left in it. She turned to go, and she could not stop herself from looking once more at the old man, at the patch, at the wrist of the hand that had held hers, at the pale, steady eyes. And what was in her face was no longer contempt. It was the beginning of the worst and most useful feeling a young person can have, which is the understanding of exactly how wrong they have been. "Commander." The old man spoke for the first time since the Admiral had come down the brow. "Admiral, a moment, if you would." Both officers turned to him. On a pier where a 3-star had just held a salute, an old Master Chief's quiet request had the force of an order. "Don't enter over my patch," Ledford said. He nodded after Coyle, who had stopped at the foot of the brow. "She's a young sailor. She was wrong this morning, and she knows it now, all the way down, and that will teach her more than anything you can write in a file. Don't take her watch away for good. Let her learn it standing up." He paused, and something that was almost a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "We were all certain of something once. The water cures that, given time. Give her the time." Ashworth looked at the old man for a long moment, and then he nodded slowly. "You always did bring everybody home, Master Chief," he said quietly. "Even the ones who did not deserve it." "Especially those," the old man said. "Honor the ones who carry it in silence. Subscribe to the veteran vault, and let this old frog man's story find the people who need it." They piped him aboard properly then. Eugene Ledford came up the brow he had been turned away from, with a vice-admiral on one side and a senior chief on the other, and he requested permission to come aboard. And this time, the quarterdeck rendered it with everything the Navy had. The reunion swallowed him gently. Old men who had known the name found the face. There were long handshakes and few words, the way it is among men who have nothing left to prove to each other. One of them, a man even older than Ledford, gripped his hand in both of his and could not speak at all, only held on, and Ledford held back and said, I know. It was a long time ago, and it was yesterday." And the two old frogmen stood like that for a while in the middle of the reunion, while the bunting snapped overhead and the young sailors flowed around them. They had been in the water together once, in a country that no longer existed by the name they had known it. There was no need to say anything more than that. The young passing by gave them room without being told, sensing, the way the young sometimes do, that they were standing near something they had not yet earned the right to interrupt. It was dusk when they found him again, alone at the fantail rail, looking out over the harbor at the failing light on the water. He had taken something small from his jacket pocket, a single worn trident, brass gone soft and dark with handling, and he held it a moment in his open palm. A pace behind him stood Sloane Coyle. She had come to find him, off watch, out of uniform now, her eyes red. She did not say very much. There is not very much to say. But the old man let her stand there, a pace back, and that was its own kind of answer, the only kind he had ever dealt in. He dropped the trident over the rail. It turned once in the last light and went into the dark water without a sound. "I made it to the boats, Wade," the old man said quietly. "To the harbor, to the water that was every water. Took me a while to stop being sorry about it. I brought another one home today. Sort of. She'll do." The harbor took the little trident the way the river had once taken the man, and the old frogman stood at the rail until the light was gone, and a pace behind him, a young officer learned at last how to stand a watch. Some warriors fade quietly into the years, but the valor never leaves them. Honor the ones who carry it in silence. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to the Veteran Vault for more.